Hello, fifth graders. Thank you for joining me for the reading. We're going to be reading through this packet together, Danaüs, Perseus, and the Gorgon. And so your homework, in addition to studying for Friday's test, is going to be addressing two questions. So, what quote shows an example of foreshadowing? So as we're reading this story, you want to find one quote that shows an example of foreshadowing. And then the second question for your homework is going to be, what quote shows when that foreshadowing is fulfilled? So remember, for fulfilled, we're saying, when does it come true? Or when does it happen? So you're going to find a quote. So a couple of things to note. First of all, you don't have to write these down. I have an attached form that you're going to complete, a Google form. So this is more just so that as we're getting started, you guys are aware that these are the two questions you should be thinking about as we're reading. What quote shows an example of foreshadowing, and what quote shows when that foreshadowing is fulfilled? In other words, when it happens. Remember that when we're talking about a quote, that means the author's exact words. So if you're including a quote, it should be exactly what the author has written. It shouldn't be kind of your paraphrasing or about what you think it is. It should be the author's exact words. So again, yes, your homework is to study using that study guide, and then also these two questions, which will be in an attached Google form. So if you do not have your copy out, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and get it out. And I'm going to have you guys actually not looking at you, remember, if you're practicing your reading, you should be looking at the words while I'm reading. So not looking at me, but looking at the words in the story and following along. But I'm going to keep the camera pointed at me today because there are going to be some pictures that I'm going to show as we read. And some of the pictures will be beautifully drawn by me, and others of the pictures will be beautifully printed from the computer. So hopefully by now you have your copy of the story out. And I'm going to repeat what I just said, which is that, of course, as we're working on becoming better readers, we want to make sure that our eyes are following along as you are listening to the words that I'm saying. That's what's going to help you to improve your fluency. Okay? So, Danaüs, Perseus, and the Gorgon. Loud was the song of the Muses about Danaüs, first of a line of great kings and heroes. King Danaüs of Libya had 50 daughters. His brother, King Aegyptus, had 50 sons. The 50 sons wanted to marry the 50 daughters, but they were rough and rowdy, and King Danaüs did not want them for sons-in-law. He feared that they might carry off his daughters by force, so secretly he built a ship with 50 oars and fled with his daughters. The 50 princesses pulled at the oars and rowed the ship across the wide sea. They reached Argos in Greece, and when the people there saw the king standing in the prow of a gorgeous ship rowed by princesses, they were awed. They were certain that Danaüs had been sent by the gods and made him their king. Danaüs was a good ruler, and peace and happiness reigned in Argos until one day another splendid ship arrived. And who should be at the oars but King Aegyptus's 50 sons, who had come to claim their brides? Danaüs did not dare to oppose them, and had a lavish wedding feast prepared. But secretly he gave each of his 50 daughters a dagger and ordered them all to kill their husbands as soon as they were alone. 49 of the brides obeyed him. But Hypermnestra, the eldest, fell in love with Lynceus, her prince, and fled with him. In vain did Danaüs try to find new husbands for his widowed daughters. Nobody dared to marry them. Probably not surprising, right? If their first husbands were killed by them, it's hard to find a second husband. The 49 Danaides had to live a life without joy, and when they died and came to the underworld, they were sentenced to carry water forever in sieves, trying in vain to fill a bath and wash off their sins. So a sieve would be like a container that has holes in it. So anytime they scooped up water, the water would come out of it. When King Danaüs grew old, there was no heir to his throne, and he had to send for Hypermnestra and Lynceus, who were living in great happiness. They became king and queen of Argos, and their son became king after them. When he died, his son Acrisius inherited the throne. Acrisius, however, had no son. He had only a beautiful golden-haired daughter whose name was Danae, but her beauty brought no joy to her father. He wanted a son and heir to his kingdom. Okay, so a lot just kind of happened really rapidly. Okay, we know that there is Danaüs, who is a father to 50 daughters. There's also Aegyptus, who is a father to 50 sons. So remember, the 50 daughters married the 50 sons, but the 50 sons were rowdy and dangerous and wild. And so 49 of these daughters killed 49 of these sons. But then we hear about a secret. Hypermnestra, who is the oldest of these daughters, I shouldn't have an arrow there. I should say one of them. So we'll do maybe this kind of an arrow. Hypermnestra married one of the sons, who is Lynceus. Okay, so King Danaüs eventually dies after being made king of Argos. And so then Hypermnestra and Lynceus are brought in to make king and queen of Argos. So then they died and had a son named Acrisius. Then Acrisius, I mistold, there's one in the middle. There is actually a question mark son, I'm sorry, fifth graders, who is unnamed, and then comes Acrisius. But Acrisius doesn't have a son. He only has his daughter, Danae. And at this point in time, the daughter would not inherit the throne, right? You want a king. And so he is speaking that even though she's beautiful and wonderful, he's not happy about that because he wants a male heir to the throne. Actually, that's going to come up later this year, a male heir. When an oracle is like somebody who, or something, a place where you go to get visions of the future. Visions of the future, maybe hints about things that are to come. What is today's lesson about? Something called foreshadowing, which remember is a hint from the author about something that will happen later. And we talked a lot about how prophecies and dreams are ways that these foreshadowings happen. And a prophecy is often something that an oracle says. Interesting. When an oracle told him that he would die by the hand of his daughter's son, he put Danae in a sealed chamber that had neither windows nor doors, only an opening in the roof. So Acrisius is told by an oracle that his daughter's son, which is like his grandson, is going to kill him. Interesting. So he locks her up. There, no suitor could see her beauty, and she would remain unwed and childless. But Acrisius forgot to reckon with Zeus. The thunder god spied the lonesome maiden through an opening in the roof, and in the shape of a golden shower he descended to her. No longer was Danae lonesome, for now she was the happy bride of Zeus. So we see she is one of the wives of Zeus. But when her father heard the cries of an infant from her chamber, he broke through the walls in a rage, intending to kill his grandson. When he learned that Zeus was the child's father, he did not dare to lay hands on him. Instead, he put Danae and her son, Perseus, in a chest and threw it into the sea. If they drowned, Poseidon would be to blame. So he thinks he's kind of worked around it by blaming this on Poseidon. But now you can see there's kind of this long family tree. Zeus gently steered the chest to the shore of an island, and a fisherman who was casting his nets hauled it in. Great was his surprise when he saw what the chest contained. When Danae had told him her story, he took her and little Perseus to his hut and cared for them as if they were his own, for he was a kind old man and childless. In his humble hut, Perseus grew into a fine and valiant youth, proud of being the son of Zeus and the beautiful Danae. But Danae's beauty attracted the eye of a ruthless king of the island. He wanted her for his queen. In vain did Danae turn him away, meaning she was not able to turn him away. She was the bride of Zeus and swore that she could marry no other. The king pursued her and would have carried her off by force if Perseus had not protected her. Her son protected her. The scheming king decided to get rid of Perseus, and he let it be known that he was going to marry a princess from a neighboring island. As was the custom, all the men in the kingdom brought him gifts. Only Perseus was so poor that he had nothing to give. So he offered his services to the king instead. This was just what the king had expected. "Slay the monster Medusa and bring me her head," he said. No man who had ever set out to kill Medusa had come back, and the king was sure that now he was forever rid of Perseus. Medusa was one of 3 horrible Gorgon sisters, so gruesome that all living creatures turned to stone at the sight of them. Here they all are. Medusa's the one in the middle, but you can see all of the Gorgon sisters. They lived on an island far out at sea, but nobody knew just where. Perseus bid his mother goodbye and set out to search for Medusa. He went over land and over sea, asking his way, but nobody could tell him where the Gorgons lived. As he stood at a crossroad, wondering which way to go, Athena and Hermes suddenly appeared. Zeus had sent them to help him. They could tell him the way to the island of the Gorgons, but he needed more help than that. Athena lent him her shield, polished as brightly as a mirror. Hermes lent him his sword, which was so sharp that it could cut through the hardest metal. And he also needed 3 magic things owned by the nymphs of the north. They told him, but even the gods did not know where these nymphs lived. That was a secret closely guarded by the 3 gray sisters, and they would never willingly reveal it, for they were the Gorgon sisters. But Hermes offered to take Perseus to them and find a way to get the secret out of them. He took Perseus under his arm, swung himself into the air, and flew off swifter than the wind. They flew far, far to the west, and at last they came to a land where the sun never shone and everything was as gray as dusk. There sat the 3 gray sisters. Their hair was gray, their faces were gray, and they had only one gray eye between them, which they took turns looking through. As one of the sisters was handing the eye to another, Perseus sprang forward and snatched it. The 3 gray sisters wailed and begged for their eye, but Perseus would not give it back, and so they had to tell him the way. Again, Hermes took him under his arm and flew with him far, far to the north, beyond the north wind where the sun never set. The nymphs of the north received them kindly, and when they heard why Perseus had come, they gladly lent him the 3 things he needed: a pair of winged sandals to carry him through the air, a cap to make him invisible, and a magic bag to hold what was put into it. Here's a picture of them giving him what he needs. Now he was ready to slay the Medusa, said Hermes. He showed him the way and wished him good luck. Wearing the winged sandals, Perseus flew far to the west. When he came to the island of the Gorgons, he did not look down. He looked instead into Athena's polished shield and shuddered at the sight he saw mirrored there. The 3 Gorgon sisters were laying on the shore, fast asleep. Long yellow fangs hung from their grinning mouths. On their heads grew writhing snakes instead of hair, and their necks were covered with scales of bronze. Around them stood the strangest stones. It was easy to see that they had once been men. So it means that they've been turned into stones by the Gorgons. Looking into the mirroring shield, Perseus swooped down, and with one deft stroke, he cut off the Medusa's head. Out from the monster's severed neck sprang a beautiful winged horse, the Pegasus. He neighed, and the other two Gorgons awoke. Quickly, Perseus threw Medusa's head into the magic bag and swung himself into the air. Wailing, the two Gorgon sisters took to the air on heavy wings in groping pursuit. They could not find him, for he had put on the magic cap of invisibility. On his way home, as he flew over the coast of Ethiopia, Perseus saw far below a beautiful maiden chained to a rock by the sea. She was so pale that at first he thought she was a marble statue. But then he saw tears trickling from her eyes. He swooped down and tore at her chains, trying to break them. "Flee," she said, "or you too will be devoured by the sea monster." But Perseus refused to leave, and she told her sad story. Her name was Andromeda, and she was the daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia. Her mother was very vain and had boasted unwisely that she was even lovelier than the Nereids. Poseidon could not tolerate having a mortal compare herself to the goddesses of the sea, and as punishment, he sent a sea monster to ravage the kingdom of Ethiopia. To appease the angry god and save his kingdom, her father had to sacrifice her, his only daughter, to the monster. And there she stood, chained to the cliff, waiting to be devoured. She had begged the prince to whom she was engaged to save her, but he had fled in fear. "I shall save you, and you shall be mine," said Perseus. As he spoke, a horrible sea monster came from the sea, its huge mouth opened wide to swallow Andromeda. But Perseus sprang into the air, dived at the monster, and drove his sword deep into its throat. The monster bellowed, lashed its tail wildly, and rolled over on its back. It sank, and the sea was tinted red by its blood. Ever since, that stretch of water has been called the Red Sea. No sooner was the monster dead than Andromeda's cowardly suitor returned with many warriors to claim her for his bride. Now he was bold and menacing, and King Cepheus did not dare to oppose him. "Andromeda, shield your eyes!" cried Perseus, and with that he lifted the head of Medusa out of the bag. The suitor and his men stared in horror, and whips! They were changed into stones. Unfortunately, the king and the queen had also looked at the Gorgon's head, and they too turned into stone. But since a son of Zeus was going to marry their daughter, the gods took pity on them and hung Cepheus and Cassiopeia in the sky as constellations. They're actually constellations still today, you may know. So this is kind of like a story. And there are a couple of origin stories, right? How the Red Sea became the Red Sea, how these constellations became constellations. So we like maybe call them creation myths. Perseus lifted, actually Andromeda is also a galaxy, the Andromeda Galaxy. Perseus lifted Andromeda into his arms and flew homewards. But when he arrived at the fisherman's hut, he learned that and the fisherman had gone into hiding. As soon as the king of the island had gotten rid of Perseus, he had tried to carry Danae off. To save her, the kind old fisherman had fled with her. When Perseus heard that, he made straight for the king's palace. "Here is the head you wanted," he shouted, and pulled Medusa's head out of the bag. Startled, the king and his men looked up, and there they sat, turned into statues of stone, some of them with their mouths still open in astonishment. The people of the island rejoiced at being rid of the tyrant, and as soon as the fisherman and Danae came out of hiding, they made the fisherman their new king. He gave Perseus and Andromeda the grandest of wedding feasts, and everybody was happy. Perseus did not keep the Gorgon's head. It was much too dangerous for a mortal to own. He gave it to Athena when he returned her shield and the other magic objects that he had borrowed. So you may have forgotten in the midst of listening to this story that we've already heard, and hopefully you identified this moment of foreshadowing, And we're also supposed to be thinking about and identifying a moment when that foreshadowing has been fulfilled. So if you've forgotten that that's what you're supposed to be thinking about, I would really focus on that second piece as we're finishing our story. Perseus thought that his grandfather, Acrisius, remember, would be happy to see him now that he was a hero, and he set sail for Argos with Danae and Andromeda. But when the old king learned that his grandson was approaching, he fled, for he still remembered the oracle's warning. And so Perseus became king of Argos. Perseus ruled wisely and well, his mother and his wife always at his side. Since he was a great athlete, he also took part in games all over Greece. One day, a sudden gust of wind changed the course of a discus he had thrown, and it killed an old man who was watching the games. Who should that old man be but Acrisius, his grandfather? Thus the words of the oracle came true. After that, Perseus no longer wanted to live in his grandfather's city, Argos. So he founded instead the splendid fortified city of Mycenae, not far away, and many great kings and heroes were descended from him and Andromeda. Actually, Mycenae you should hear about in history class. This should be a connection that you can make, that you'll learn about Mycenae from Mr. Wenninger. When at last Perseus and Andromeda died, Zeus put them too in the sky as constellations. You can see some of these constellations here. So, fifth graders, reminder that for your homework, in addition to studying for Friday's test, there's a form attached, and you should be putting a quote from the story that shows an example of foreshadowing. It happened pretty early in the story. And then a quote that shows when that foreshadowing was fulfilled or came true, which again is pretty close to the end of the story. So good luck. Can't wait to see what you do. And let me know if you have any questions.